Thank you. So I don't look like that anymore. I'm sorry about the very old photograph, but we all get older. It happens to the best of us. I'm very happy to be here. Happy to see so many of you here. Happy to experience Manila for the first time. And happy to try to follow up Edson, who I've known for a long time. We taught in Cincinnati together. And he gave you a very precise idea about what is going on in our urban environment and what we might do about it. So I'm going to take his very precise analysis and make it very confused. And it's going to be even more confused because the sun is going to blur all the structures. So we'll do the best we can. So one of the things that I'm going to react against a little bit is when I got the invitation to come speak here. Part of the invitation was his response to the governmental exhortation to build. And I would say, don't build, don't build, don't build. I think the last thing that we need is to make new buildings. So if any of you are architects, you're going to be very mad at me. And if any of you are architecture students, you're going to be perhaps somewhat frustrated. Because I think that the last thing that we need in our world is more buildings. We have more than enough buildings already. And every building is an act of violence and destruction that uses up natural resources that we can no longer afford to waste. You know, it's quite frankly appalling for me to see some of these ads that just preceded my talk that show these gleaming glass buildings that are supposed to be eco-friendly. Not only do they look like shit, but they represent shit, which is they try to cure with some technological systems the inherent problem of making buildings, which is that depending on who you talk to, construction is somewhere between the second and the seventh largest cause of pollution in our urban environments. And it's not just the emanations of the buildings themselves, it's the act of construction. But it's very difficult to not waste a huge amount of resources. So even if you make a building that's completely net zero, you're still going to use up a lot of concrete, a lot of steel, a lot of plastics, a lot of oil, therefore, and you're still going to be polluting just by bringing all that material there. Not only that, but when you make a building, the result will almost inevitably be horrible. I'm sorry, but that's just the way it is. My mentor got himself, who's an architect called Frank Gehry, got himself in a lot of trouble a couple of years ago because he said that 98% of everything that is built out there is shit. I actually think he was being kind. I think it's probably more than 99%, despite all the best efforts by architects. Not only that, but as you just heard from Edson, any act of building imprisons us in an air-conditioned cocoon that is reserved for only those people who can afford it, and that separates us out into separate classes. So, buildings, in other words, are not sustainable. They're horribly ugly and destructive of our environment, and they are socially divisive. And yet, I really love architecture, and I'm very hopeful for architecture. Now, how do I explain that? I explain that by saying that architecture is not building. it's very easy in the English language. I don't know about in Tagalog, but in the English language, it's very easy because there are two different words, right? Buildings are buildings, and to build something is building, but architecture is everything that is about building. It's how we think about buildings, it's how we design buildings, it's how we represent building, it's the meta of building. Therefore, obviously, buildings are the most complete statement of architecture. The problem is that by that very same token, buildings are also the tomb of architecture. Architecture is buried in buildings. It's very difficult to find architecture in buildings. And not only that, but the design of buildings is defined by codes. Life safety codes, of course, building codes, but of course also financial codes, value engineering, and of course these days computer codes that pre-design your building for you completely. Part of the things that Edson was talking about, which he didn't specify, is that these days a huge amount of buildings in the United States get a swirl from the architect and then they are binned in the Philippines. They are produced by computers here in the Philippines, almost automatically. So there's very little that the architects can do. So I think we have to look beyond buildings, hence the title of my lecture. We have to look at what's inside of buildings, we have to look at what is beyond the reality that we have today and figure out what we can do. And that's what I want to try and show you in a lot of different slides. So this is sort of where architecture is right now, right? This is where I'm staying. This is designed by a group called Wow Architecture. I'm sorry if any of you are present, but can you please change the name of your firm? I mean, Wow Architecture? Please. And so they do this kind of new neo-UN studio architecture, right? And it's kind of okay, it's not too badly done, but that's the extent of architecture, making the roof line curve. Actually, this is the one moment, if you can see it, that I really think is architecture. I can take someone, I can take like one of the people who work in the hotel, and if I'm trying to explain why this building is architecture, I can point to this weird place where the roof folds up and makes an extra high space that has absolutely no function, that's completely useless, but actually creates a nice sense of light and a nice sense of space. I mean, this is actually a pretty good moment within this building. Which is to say that architecture is exactly, contrary to what you've been taught, everything that is useless about a building. Architecture has no function. Architecture is actually what lets you experience, what lets you see the building. What, in a very old-fashioned term, ennobles a building. But here's what's really good here. You know why you don't need to make any more buildings? I've only been here for 2 days, and I have seen so many fucking buildings that really need to be renovated, that are so beautiful, that are so worthy of re-inhabitation. I've seen so many parts of the city just in 2 days that could be reused, relived, could be celebrated, that I think you would be absolutely crazy to build even 1 square meter of new building until you rebuild these, reuse them, rethink them, utter them for what they are. So, having said that, what are we aiming for? Edson very cleverly, and I think that's, I almost did that too, Edson left his talk with the idea that you all need to do something. Well, what the hell do you need to do? So I'll try to show a bunch of examples of some of the things you could think about. So this is kind of the ideal of a truly organic, environmental, eco-friendly architecture, right? Does anyone know what this is?
Guardians of the Galaxy.
All right, you win the prize. Someone give her the prize. Legends of the Gallery Part 2. It's actually a pretty horrible movie. Not nearly as good as the first one. But it has this incredible vision of this planet that is also a brain, that is also a whole person. You get a prize, yeah, I don't know. Someone have a prize for it? I'll give you a prize later. Sorry, I don't have one right now. John, maybe you have a prize for it? So, this is the brain, right? That is also a planet that's also a whole reality. So this is kind of what we dream about. But in reality, I bet you that all of you who are architects are dreaming of making this, right? This is the alpha and the omega of current building practice. This is the most expensive building in the world, the most perfect building in the world, right? And it is, of course, the headquarters of Apple, which makes it even more perfect. It is the ultimate Dilbert land, from which there's no escape because it's completely circular. So you keep running around from cubicle to cubicle, running into perfectly formed, perfectly curved glass walls. And it sits like a spaceship, completely alienated from its surroundings, in all of its perfection, with all of the craft and skill that architecture can manage. And right at the center, I have no doubt, but Steve Jobs is buried right there and is still watching over the empire that he started, trying to control everything. This is about as perfect as you can make buildings today. Except it doesn't work, because this is now where a whole bunch of people from Apple have to work. Because as soon as the building was finished, it was already out of date. And that's the other problem with making buildings. Buildings are a huge waste of time and money, not only from a sustainability, but also because they never fit our lives. They almost immediately have to be renovated or expanded. So all of these people at Apple have to work in this horrible building right next door that, as far as I'm concerned, should be blown up right now. And of course, behind all of that, there's a much deeper problem, which is that what Apple makes is, of course, this thing, right? Or its many imitators that I'm sure most of you have. And we are seeing whole worlds appearing on that phone, and architects say, oh, but it's not real. It's just chat and sexting and all kinds of other stuff. But of course it is. This is where more and more of our life is taking place. This is where we make social connections. This is where we express our faith. This is where we find sex. This is where we do all the things that bring us together as human beings, which means that we are at everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And that, in a physical sense, as Edson already pointed out, means that we live in this world of sprawl. And it's here in Manila, just as it's everywhere. This spread of human occupation that completely wipes out the distinction between urban and suburban and ex-urban, that devastates the landscape all around it. And I live in one of the headquarters of Sprawl, Phoenix, where they're using up an acre of land every week for new construction, and all of the riparian structure and all of the desert just disappears behind this stuff. But it's not just there. It's in Tokyo, it's in Germany, it's in Pakistan, it's in Africa, it's in fact, Manila. And I wish I had those NASA photographs, but the amount of sprawl in Metro Manila is astonishing and goes beyond even most Asian cities in terms of the speed and the dispersion of its growth. And within that sprawl, we all indeed live in these tightly packed little houses, cocooned from the weather, from other people, from anything that we feel might injure us, on these metastasized versions of the great grid that is supposed to make everything possible. We live in complete isolation. We define the buildings only by whatever materials is available, and we define what is our home by how much of the lawn we actually cut. And we find ourselves absolutely anywhere. Okay, one more time. I don't have any prizes to give, but what is this? What is this? No, not Vegas. Come on. Nobody? What? No. It's a television series.
Breaking Bad.
Breaking Bad. Thank you. God. All right, you all failed. Breaking Bad. Now, the ironic thing about this image is it's in fact in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And if you Google, as I did last year when I first wanted to use a slide like this, I said, look, let me check Breaking Bad. So I Googled Breaking Bad, and the first thing that showed up was 2 different companies that will take you on a tour of all of the sites in Albuquerque where Breaking Bad took place. Now that's bizarre because, of course, the whole point of that series, and of suburbia in general, is that your high school math teacher could be cooking math in the house next door while you're having an adulterous affair in your house, and someone is bringing up 2 very good, well-behaved Christian children in the 3rd house, and the 4th house might be a sweatshop. It is absolutely unavailable to our knowledge what is going on in all these places. And the character of all of this is that it's beige. It's all the same color. It'd be interesting to see whether the color in Metro Manila is slightly different. I get the feeling it is. But in most of the United States and Europe, this was done by architect Jürgen Meyer, who wrote what he called the Latte Manifesto, which was quickly renamed the You Can Imagine What Manifesto. And he pointed out that all of exurbia, suburbia is in the same shades of this brown, right? And it goes from a kind of slightly rosy red in the desert where I live to a more gray on the east coast of America and parts of northern Germany. But it's also the same. And the thing that makes it work is that everywhere at all times, Big Brother or Big Sister is watching us, is completely controlling everything we do. Architecture doesn't matter. What matters is how all of the devices that control our life are completely embedded in this environment. And beyond that, of course, the problem is that we don't know whether any of it's real. In fact, none of it is real, because most of the materials, that's still probably a rock, and you would have to really examine it to find its molecular structure. But all of this stuff is a human creation. It's all the products of zeros and ones and various other codes. So we do live in this completely fictitious world, and the people who control the codes and the formulas don't even have to watch us. They control us completely and utterly, and whether we in fact are still human beings is completely open for question. So what do? Well, the most obvious answer in architecture and design for the last 20 years has been just go with it, dude. Just go with the flow. Just realize, as the adherents of, I don't know if Triple O has hit the Philippines yet. Has Triple O hit the Philippines yet? Okay, if any of you students and you want to impress your classmates, start throwing around Triple O, object-oriented ontology. It's the hip new theory, which probably means it's already out. But the idea is that we all live in this hyper-object, and that the fiction of the human body or of any object only becomes apparent as a fiction when it doesn't work, or when it breaks down. And everything has only a tool value. So you can make buildings, as Mark Foster Gage does, out of any set of artificial environments. And of course, you can just use those zeros and ones, all of those parametric formulas, to just spin out absolutely impossible words. And if you go on Sucker Punch or any of those sites, you will find these incredible structures that students are producing over and over again. But Then, of course, when they get built, they turn into just another affirmation of the fact that neoliberal capitalism allows us to move everywhere at all times, even in China, and they become corporate structures. Does this make a difference? Does this represent the way that modernism should, the true nature of our modern world? Maybe, but it's just a picture of what might be going on in the world, a streamlining of our reality that very quickly turns into persiflage, into a satire of itself, whether it knows it or not. So I'm more interested in messing with the code. And everything I'm going to show you from now on is about not going with the code, with the flow, not just doing sprawl or making buildings, but messing it up, and rethinking it, reusing, reimagining, rethinking where we live, or in the immortal words of Missy Elliott, flip it and reverse it. So what do you do to just mess with your computer? Turn on Photoshop, turn on your bestiary of all of those computer codes you're so good at using, and figure out how you can make something impossible. Something that is a deformation of the world in which we live today. Something that proposes that we could extrapolate our world even if it's not something that we can necessarily construct. And that means that we also fundamentally question this whole notion of reality, of progress. And the best way I can think of showing that is I live in Frank Lloyd Wright world. I can't help it. So I'm very sure you've all heard of Frank Lloyd Wright. He is God, according to some people. He was actually an architect. He did a whole number of buildings, over 1,200. Some of them pretty great, some of them not, but a lot of them pretty great. And this was one of his best, the Larkin Building, torn down a century ago in Buffalo, New York. Foundations are still there. And here's an image of it, how it might look today down to the raindrops on the street. And you're supposed to say, oh, this is so fake. This is so awful. How could you recreate something that doesn't exist? This is Disneyland. Yes, but that's because we're so caught up in this aura of the reality of buildings. And maybe it wouldn't be so bad to make a new kind of fictional architecture, to reimagine function, use, reality, to restage, as Elm Green and Dragset did, a new reality. And one of my favorite projects that sums this up is by an artist called Doug Aitken, who took over one of the worst pieces of architecture in the United States, this giant pillbox that sort of reminds me of your art museum, or your performing arts center here, called the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C. And he completely covered it with this project called Song 1, which was all of sprawl. Cafes, parking garages, ports, shopping malls, suburban homes, abandoned streets, that he just projected onto this round shape while the song kept saying over and over again, I only have eyes for you, I only have eyes for you, this love song to this world of sprawl that perversely made us feel completely at home in this immersive but completely unreal space, and people would sit there, I don't know if you can see it, and tailgate as if they were watching an outdoor movie, which it was. And so architecture is beginning to come to terms with the fact that one of the ways it might come to terms with unreality, with the absurdity of its position, is to go with that particular flow, to be as unreal as possible. Another one of my favorite projects is by MVRVD. Vinny Mas, who's one of the founders of the firm, when he was 9 years old, he sent a letter to the mayor of the small town where he grew up, called Spangle, and said, Mr. Mayor, I'm going to be an architect someday, and we need to design the town plaza, and here's my drawing for it. 40 years later, he gets a phone call from this small town. They said, we always kept that letter of yours because it was such a cool drawing. Now that you're a famous architect, we need you to come back and actually redesign our town square. Except, like in the Philippines, what is a town square these days? It's a shopping mall. We need a shopping mall. So he went there with a very good photographer. They photographed all of the buildings in the area, combined them in Photoshop into one single structure that summed up all of the buildings of this little village, and then blew it up 120% and printed it on glass so that it's a building that isn't there. It's an unreal building that yet is very real, and where you can buy clothes and get a cappuccino. So architecture at its most radical for me is an architecture in which the buildings are disappearing into climactic effects, as in the work of Philippe Ram, here working in Taiwan. And it reminds me of another great artwork by the photographer Hiroshi Tsukamoto. And Tsukamoto made a series that brought to the forefront one of the great emblems of modernism. You know, we've all been trained in modernism that the perfect form, the perfect image we can make is pure abstraction, pure white, the white emblem of what is to come, a utopia of nothingness. Mies van der Rohe said he wanted to make almost nothing. Most architects want to go beyond that and make the perfect nothing. And so Tsukamoto found it. He found that nothingness by training his camera on a movie that was playing, leaving the lens open the whole time so that all of the story, all of the love, all of the car chases, all of the horror disappeared into perfect light. And he had that perfect emblem. Except when you look at the image, your eye starts wandering around the edges, and you see the beauty of everything that remains of the old movie theaters in which this is playing. And all of that reality comes out. The ghost of architecture appears. And that, for me, is what is interesting about architecture today. It is haunted by the ghost of its possible future, this perfect utopia in which we're going to make perfect buildings, and the failure of that dream. It is haunted by the ghost, the horror of its complicity with social division and with environmental destruction. And it would do best to strip itself down to the bones, to the bare skeleton, and find within that the building blocks for architecture. An architecture that might be as simple as just putting a wall in the middle of a church, as Estonia did in a church for the Venice Biennale last year. Creating a division, a break, a cut within the space that represents something completely normal, something not grand and monumental. The best architecture these days is architecture that's very difficult to find, that looks, in fact, like it might not even be there, that is just a hint in the empty room, that might only go so far as to, by changing the scale, make you realize how weird, how other, how different it is. Architecture could just be putting some traffic cones down in the middle of a plaza in the civic center of Shenzhen. If architecture is going to do anything, it's going to afford many different uses rather than pretend to be useful. Here's another term that's very hot these days, it's affordances. The notion that you afford different uses, as Snøhetta did in this library they did at Ryerson Library. The counterpoint to the Apple headquarters, designed for, depending on who you talk to, somewhere between $1.2 billion and $1.5 billion, is the Facebook headquarters. Mark Zuckerberg went around the world trying to find an architect to design his new headquarters, walked into Frank Gehry's office, which was a complete mess, with people just working in this leftover warehouse building in the middle of the sprawl of LA, looked around and said, give me this. But I need about 3 or 4 million square feet of it. So that's what they did for the Facebook headquarters, just spun out this reused warehouse at 4 million square feet. If you're going to find something to fix, something to fixate on what is left and fetishize it. I'm all for fetishization because fetishization lets us have an anchor in the world all around us. This is the work of David Ireland, an artist who took over a very normal building in San Francisco about 50 years ago and didn't just renovate it, but embalmed it, polished it, shellacked it, rubbed honey on it, made it into a gleaming memory of everything that was there, down to the place where the safe had nicked the wall when he tried to move it out. Here is architecture that doesn't propose something new, but asks us to wonder about what we already have and whether that makes us human or not. The simple lesson from that is that architecture should first and foremost be reuse, a rethinking of what we already have. I think it's the task of every architect when a client asks them, build me a new building, to say, do you really need a new building? Why do you need a new building? Maybe you just need a new logo. Maybe you just need to use what you have more efficiently. Maybe you need to think about how you could bring out the aspects of what is already there. You can use architecture as a kind of archaeology, as a kind of Baroque exploration of what already exists. And it can be either within a building, or it can be at the scale of a whole ironworks in the middle of the Loire Valley that's now a beer garden and a museum and a swimming pool and a climbing wall and many other things. Architecture is not necessarily about making it new, but remaking it new, about extending what we already have and reusing materials. This is a group called 2012 Architects who does these things called harvest maps, which you can download at harvestmap.org. That's a software that allows you to figure out what in your neighborhood you can reuse, and that's not just some lumber. It can be kitchen sinks, it can be washing machines, it can be tire trucks, it can be car seats. All of the detritus of our consumer society is available, not just because it's available, but because it's already there. It has meaning that inheres. It has a beauty that already exists. It allows you, like this project, the Heidelberg project that Wayne Hooten did in Detroit, or Piaster Gates project in Chicago, it allows you to make a community. You know, Piaster Gates, trained as an urban designer, then as a ceramicist, now is an artist and community organizer in Chicago, who assembled this house not only out of leftover building materials, but also out of the record collections and the magazine collections of the community so that he could create a place there. Another one of my favorite current projects is going on right now in Mexico, where Infonavit, which is the largest social mortgage and social building company, had a very progressive new leader, Carlos Cedillo, who said, we're not going to make any more new housing. That's just a prison for the poorest people. We're going to figure out how to reuse, how to reimagine existing structure. We're going to figure out how to make temporary communities. This is the owner of Zappos Shoes, creating his own little community in the middle of downtown Las Vegas. It's about not separating us, but connecting us through architecture. A lot of this is summed up for me in the work of the artist Mark Bradford, who for this series went around the neighborhood where he lives in Los Angeles and collected all the handbills selling things, lost cat, boxing match here, brought them into the studio, put them on the canvas, slathered automobile paint on them, scraped it away, put on more wheels, put on more paint, scraped it away, and kept going until what he had was what he called a map of Los Angeles. Something that allowed him to be at home in his own particular world. By reusing materials, like Aravena did for the Biennale 2 times ago, we make visible what's usually hidden in the wall. We explode out the parts of the past. We gather together waste and turn it into that which is useless but beautiful, that which is connected, that which we might call art, or I would say architecture. You can do that with physical materials. You can bring together the leftovers of a house and turn it into an artwork that now sits in a museum, or you can even take all of the materials in a Volkswagen Bug and condense it into these blocks that represent the side of all of the materials. You can take all of the leftovers of your youth in the 80s or 90s or noughts, as Sterling Ruby did, and turn that into artwork. This is another one of my favorite projects. This was a SciArt student project and was called the Chicken Project. I have no idea what it means, but it's supposedly a house for the student's grandmother in China that's made completely out of chicken parts and chicken bacon and images of chicken made gold, all assembled into this giant piece of architecture. You can make that assembly by taking bits and pieces you get at a 5 and dime show and activating it with the piezoelectric energy of the body, as Phil Beasley did. You can even do it digitally, as Perry Kopler did, with all of the images that he finds. And that, in fact, is becoming more and more part of this assembly of architecture, this hunting and gathering of images and forms and materials to create something that could even be the electrostatic charging of a building in Bangkok, so that all of the dirt and pollution of that city becomes a protective pelt over this museum glass box. Architecture, in other words, becomes a cloud, or it becomes just a garden. You know, beyond building is landscape. One of the things I love about this event is that we're not in buildings. We're in ruins. We're reusing existing structure. We're in gardens. And it can be the leftover rubbish dump in the back of a park in Germany. Or it can be a staircase in a pile of rocks that marks a path in Sicily. The single most successful piece of architecture in the United States in the last 50 years, not only maybe aesthetically, but economically, is not a building. It is the High Line, this great line that stretches to 1.5 miles of Manhattan, that has created somewhere between $2 and $12 billion worth of property value, just by allowing you to see the city in a different way. And it's now being imitated all over the place, opening up gardens in cities all around the world. That kind of reuse of nature, rethinking of our natural environment should be integral to what we do in architecture. It's how we are going to solve a lot of the problems of our urban sprawl by realizing that we need to not just sprawl out into nature, but bring nature back into our cities. And some of the best work at Intramuros, the one that they won the Eastern Row Award for, was the making of this courtyard structure. Of course, big business is already taken over. This is Nike playing with it. But this is another great project I love by Assemblage in London, Assemblage Studio, and it reminds me of a story a couple of years ago. A young firm in Belgium received a commission in a competition to redo a town square in a small village. They were very excited, they were very young, very earnest, so they did all their research. They looked at the hydrology, they looked at the rainfall, they looked at the wind direction, They looked at all the bus maps. They went and interviewed people on the street. They had workshops. They modeled everything. And they wrote a big report about that fit. And at the very last page, the last sentence is, do nothing. Leave it exactly the way it is. And here's a bill for 20,000 euros. Because maybe what's already there is good enough. We all know Barcelona as this site of great urban structures and great urban projects with these grand new plazas and boulevards. Well, this is the latest park in Barcelona, a former gun emplacement on which people have built illegal houses, and the architects who won this competition said, just leave it the way it is. Take down only what you need so you can look out and see the environment and so that people won't hurt themselves. Leave it exactly the way it is. So what we need to do is not to build, but to unbuild, to open up what we have, to reveal what's hiding within our structures, to tear away at the blank walls that completely surround us. Oh, more than enough time. That completely surround us, that keep us separated, and to tear those walls out and turn them into objects that might be able to engage us. Some of the best work today is taking all of the things that are hidden within our buildings, the air conditioning ducts, the studs, all the stuff that you're not supposed to see, and saying that's where the architecture is. The architecture is in the building, the misbuilding, the unbuilding, the not building. It is about reusing and rethinking what we already have. This is a very famous building, the Torre David in Caracas, that, as some of you might know, was half finished and then sat there for years, and one night a whole group of people came in and invaded it and started occupying it up until the 20th floor. The firm Urban Think Tank went in and said, what can we do as architects? And they went in with the photographer Ivan Bog, not in order to bring the building up to code or to offer those services, but first and foremost to look, to document, to see. For me, architecture should start with looking, seeing what we have, seeing what the possibilities of the world around us is, and what we can do it. So a lot of people will show you images like we saw in the ads, looking up at these shiny buildings, look how tall we're making something, look how gleaming and eco-friendly it all is. I'm more interested in these two crazy Russian guys who climb onto skyscrapers, dangle down and take photographs looking down, seeing what we already have, seeing the vertigo of the past, not the grandeur of the future, seeing the possibility that spins all the way down from the 90th floor to the base of the building. And that's what I tried to do when I did a few years ago the Biennale at Shenzhen, which we did by collecting all kinds of material from the city and making structures out of it, whether they were the detritus of the street, the houseplants, beer crates that turned into something you could rent on Airbnb, or all of the leftover books that none of us could read that made a cocoon where you could feel at home in this continually changing world, while the outside was completely covered with abandoned toys, some of them even sex toys, and all kinds of other things that the architects had found on the streets. And that's what I'm trying to do at Taliesin. We're sitting there for half a year in the middle of sprawl, one of the worst examples of sprawl, in this structure that Frank Lloyd Wright built as a winter camp. He built it as the desert turned into a platform onto which people could gather, a gathering together of people and of rocks into a community that was covered only with a tent that eventually became a living room where we can talk and a studio that we could work. And he did it at his original home in Taliesin, where starting in 1932, he gathered students from all over the world and said, we're going to figure out how to make this world better. We're going to make architecture, we're going to dance, we're going to sing, we're going to work the fields, we're going to cook, and you're going to do my laundry, by the way, as well. And you're going to pay me for all of this. And we're going to be a community that is going to figure out how we can make a human-made forest in which we're going to recraft the environment all around us. And that's what our students are doing, figuring out how to use and misuse our buildings, crawling through its structures, crawling out into the world to sprawl, to see if they connect it, reusing pieces of Frank Lloyd Wright buildings into strange new assemblies that might not quite be possible, reconnecting disparate parts of the city, towering up into impossible structures, and imagining what a dystopian rather than a utopian future might be. They are also just not building. This was one of my favorite projects. It's very difficult to show because the whole point is it's not there. I took all of my students to Rome for 5 weeks and had them design a mosque in the middle of Rome. Very difficult. So one of the students said, I have the perfect solution. Believe it or not, there's always been a mosque here, just buried underground. And he turned on Photoshop and showed that actually there was a mosque buried under the ground. And just proposed that we dig it back out and then we reuse a lamppost to be the sign of the mosque. That's all the architecture you need. But at the core of what we do at Taliesin and how we're trying to bring all of this experimentation together is that all of our students, while we're at Taliesin West, live in desert shelters with no electricity and running water that they have to build themselves, design and build themselves. And so they first use ones that have been left by the last students and renovate them and fix them up and make new structures or rehabilitate ones so that they can inhabit them. And then they have to design and build their own. This is one of a student who graduated 2 years ago getting a crit from Todd Williams and Billy Tsin about everything that was wrong with his building, even though it was already sort of finished. These are some of the last structures that have just been finished, and now we're looking forward to a new generation of structures that is just in the planning stages. This actually, which looks like a map, I just got the text this morning, is now a series of rammed earth walls that are now 12 feet tall. But I want to leave you with this great structure because to me this is the ghost of architecture that is yet a hopeful construction of what we could be doing. The original desert shelters that were done when Frank Lloyd Wright was still alive were made out of what he called desert concrete, which consisted of just gathering the boulders that were around there, using as little cement as possible, and making it coherent to a wall, and then reusing a Basque shepherd's tent and placing that on top of the stone. So this student just did that, except when you get close, you realize that it's actually a photograph of desert concrete on plexiglass, and that the roof is a print of canvas on top of metal panels. So that night, it's a scaffolding, a glowing contradiction, something that for me is the emblem of what architecture could become. So if you're interested in trying to figure out how we can flip it and reverse it, how we can experiment, how we can make an architecture beyond buildings, come join us at Taliesin. We would love to see you there. We're taking applications now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Betsky. And now, we are opening the floor for your questions. Can you state your name, your company, and the school where you're from? So, any hands from the audience? Okay.
Hi, my name is Jason Buensalido from Buensalido Architects. I just want to say that I appreciate the presentation that you've just done, and it's sort of mind-boggling for us architects because we're so preoccupied with building, as you said. But the challenge, as you set forth, is how to unbuild, right, and moving forward. And the way that I see it, at least in a historical sort of manner, is that movements or collective thought has always been sort of a response to a previous one, in the same way that, let's say, modernism was a response to classical kind of architecture, postmodernism was a response to this. So the way that I see the presentation is that, in a way, it's also a response to the way that we've overbuilt, in a way, the world, right? Whether responsibly or irresponsibly, that's, I think, another set of topics that we can discuss. But I was just wondering, because I just appreciate the way that you can see the future, that you can envision a future despite what we're going through as a civilization now. I was just wondering if this kind of direction becomes a collective thought from the whole world, if we all follow suit, do you imagine a world, what kind of response do you imagine will the world pursue, I guess, as a response to this?
It's funny because you're already anticipating that this will become something. Your daughter has a question too. This will become something that will carry through, and there will be a reaction. You're probably right, but I think there also are some trends. First of all, there's just the fact that we can no longer afford to use up natural resources at the rate we are. And I don't see that changing or ending at any point. There also is the fact that we can no longer use up land. Betsky always talked about what are we going to do when we can't produce enough agriculture. It can't go on the way it is. And the sad thing is that I remember when I was a little kid, the Club of Rome was this group that produced this report in 1972 that said this already, and we haven't been listening. And it's now 60 years later, and 50 years later. We really need to start listening. And I think it'll be a long time before we will come to a realization of that. It's interesting, the president, now former president of the American Institute of Architects, supposedly the professional voice of all of the American architects, pointed out that within the next 20 to 30 years, at least a third, if not more, of all of the work in the United States that professional architects will do will be renovation, rehabilitation, and renovation. It might be that in the Philippines you have a longer way to go before you're there, but it's going to hit here as well. And I think it's just an economic reality. So will there be a reaction? Yeah, but I'm pretty sure we'll all be dead by then. So,
I have a follow-up question, if you don't mind. How do you feel about virtual reality and augmented reality crossing over to our physical reality as an option or as a possible route to this limited resources that we have around us?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can make something look better with a little projection. I mean, as what it can do. I think augmented reality itself is a little bit of a limited term. Because it's like a little pin-click installation. I think that the idea that we can manipulate our environment much more thoroughly with oral and sensory, even olfactory modes, is something that we're going to have to build into architecture more and more. So I think we should not just think about putting on glasses. I think we should think about, as I showed the Philippe Rum project, how just by changing temperature gradients, light gradients, or even smells, we can radically change our environment without having to build structures. Yes.
Good evening, Dean Betsky. My name is Kevin Low. I'm from Malaysia. I practice as an architect and I teach as well. My question is, at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned Frank Gehry being very critical of the shit that's composes 90% of the world, and then you actually said it's more like 99%. And I'm wondering what are your feelings? Do you feel that Frank Gehry himself has contributed to a good percentage of that shit. and the reason why I asked this question is because throughout your talk, you made references to very important issues that we all want to strive for, having to do with what I call content.
Yeah.
But in almost every example you give, you speak of glowing contradictions. You bring up examples that have only everything to do with either money, the 1.2 billion in revenue the High Line has raised, or looks, aesthetics, which is sexy, you get different views of the city, having very little to do with deeper issues that can all argue about. You like pink and I like blue, you like pinstripes, I like polka dots. Who's right and who's wrong, and really who bloody cares?
I would agree with you that not all of Frank Gehry's movies are particularly good, and there's certainly overproduction. There's a problem.
Most of them actually.
Well, yeah, we can argue about that. That's fine. I'm happy to do that. But the one thing I disagree with you is I think one of the problems that we've gotten involved in is to, and this is a problem that architects have had for a century and a half now, that for something to be serious and to have social meaning, it has to be stripped down and even ugly. It has to shy away from aesthetics. You're absolutely right, we can argue about aesthetics, but we have to address it. Because I think that's why my triad is always sustainable, open, and beautiful. Because I think that we need to figure out how to make things sustainably. I also think we need to make an architecture that's connective rather than imprisoning. And I also think that we need to make an architecture that gives us something to live for, that says we as human beings are in this world for a reason. And we live in a community that we cherish and in which we want our children to grow up. And the beautiful part, I'm happy to argue all night long about it, but we have to argue about it because it has to be beautiful. It can't just be a dark prison that happens to be sustainable. Well, that's what we have to. Well, then you and I disagree because I think I showed some things that by the use are addressing very, very serious issues.
We're going to have a great panel later, I think. Because I'm on the same panel as you are. So,
okay.
We'll carry on.
Continue.
Thank you.
I think we're supposed to be talking about education, but we'll figure out a way.
Thank you to Kevin. Another question?
An easier one, I hope.
Hi Aaron, I'm Chok Manalo from Design Studio Architects. You mentioned something about like the most successful works of architecture in the United States for the recent years are not really buildings.
Yeah.
And you mentioned something about the High Line, and Kevin mentioned something about the High Line too. They say it was a success. I haven't been to the High Line. They say it was a success for architecture in general or for the community. But a lot of people are saying also that it's starting to become like a symbol of inequality for the area. It was designed to accommodate like 300,000 or more visitors a year, and it ended up accommodating like millions a year. And most of these visitors are not even from, or most of these visitors and users are not even from the community. Good. So they're saying that foot traffic is getting overwhelming already. And sure, it jacked up the value of the property in the area, but then some people are also saying that it kind of jacked up the rents also, so making it unaffordable to most people. So my question is, what's your take in reimagining architecture going beyond buildings? I'm just curious, what's your take on its role in community building?
So the problem is that capitalism always wins. Back to the previous question, the High Line set out to do some things and did them very successfully that went all the way from reusing something, which in and of itself was very important, to opening up public space that have been inaccessible, and in some cases literally cutting through buildings and creating a lot more social interaction. All things that were absolutely great, but they worked too well. So completely agree. And the only thing about the traffic is really not quite true, because almost all of the visitors there come by public transportation, maybe Uber or Lyft or something like that. But the other points are absolutely true. It's become a tourist attraction. The only thing I would answer, and you were also right, it became a tool of capitalism, making new buildings. I was trying to slip in like an argument, do reuse because you can make money too, hoping to win over some architects. So I got caught in a contradiction there. I completely agree. But I would argue, and I'll put up my neck a little bit, that one of the reasons why the High Line is successful, and not just the High Line, but the prototype for this, which was the rehabilitation of the San Jose River, the Guadalupe River in San Jose, and the various European examples as well, is that they have been incredible connected devices, but not only that, they more than shiny new skyscrapers, more than monuments, have become the very hopeful emblems of urbanity. You know, I don't automatically have this belief that cities are the greatest things. I know that everyone's supposed to believe in cities. I'm not so sure. I mean, it's not even sure that cities are really more efficient than sprawl. If we could figure out how to do sprawl right, it might actually be environmentally better than dense urban cores where everything has to be brought into one place. But these kind of openings, like the High Line, make an argument for the excitement, the fantasy, the dream of the community that is open. Because the High Line is a public space, and it's not privatized. It is, in fact, completely open to everyone, and has a very wide variety of social classes. So for all of its faults, to me it's still a hopeful moment, both philosophically and as an example of reuse. So I hope that by the time you start redoing all of the Berman parks here and finding a way to reweave together your city with those, you will learn from the mistakes and problems of the High Line and figure out how to do it right here in the middle. All the questions are just one corner. It's very interesting.
The topic is not enough to be discussed for just a day first. So I think we can spend the whole month talking about the architecture. My question is that a while ago, the speaker on the other side said that the Philippines is no longer a developing nation. Well, if you say Manila, yes, it is not no longer a developing nation. But if you look at the 17 regions of the Philippines, some of it are still developing and some of it is still undeveloped. Because this is an archipelago. So my question is, architecture, can architecture alleviate poverty by stopping the commercialization of technology?
One of the interesting things I think that's happening now is that architects who are not working in Europe or America, but who are working in places like Africa and Indonesia and places like that. I don't know of the Philippines, so I would love to be more educated about that. Are figuring out how to start not with skyscrapers, but with small community efforts. We saw some yesterday from the William showed us, starting with landscapes and how to begin with the landscape. There's very interesting work that they're going in Taiwan of all places. So there's some possibilities there. And it makes me very hopeful. I think that some of the best new architects will be landscape architects from Africa and maybe the Philippines. I think that's where we're really going to learn things. The second question, though, was can architecture stop the commercialization of technology? Probably not. I am not sure what architects can do to stop that commercialization. I think for that we need a good old revolution and less the Facebook away from its owners and make public all of the private realm of the internet. Let's remember the internet was funded and started as a public good. I think someday it should be owned by the people again, and it should be a public good. But that's something that we should all do together as citizens, not just as architects. When you run for mayor, that can be one of your platforms. And we can make both our physical public space and our social network public space truly public. That would be a great platform to run on.
Hello, my name is Rick from Design for Tomorrow. I was fascinated by your idea earlier about using what's already in existence. And yesterday, I was sitting through a very animated discussion about heritage and preservation of buildings, and some of these buildings might be mistakes from the past. And since you are in the field of educating a lot of young designers, and in a way, you have a certain degree of influence in shaping the philosophies and approaches of design moving forward. Now, in contrast to that discussion yesterday, do you think that overemphasis on heritage is in direct conflict with the evolutionary nature of humanity?
No. No, I think that the one thing that you have to be clear about is what you're doing with the heritage. So I think there are many different approaches. One of the issues is that heritage has fixed into a kind of canon where you have certain rules about how you fix things up. And I think we should break those rules. We should sometimes rebuild something that doesn't exist anymore. We should sometimes tear down what is falling apart and rethink it. We should sometimes alter things in very radical ways. And other times we should embalm what we have, like the David Ireland image. I think that the problem is accepting it as a fact rather than as a historically grown fiction that turned into something physical that we now need to keep rebuilding and rethinking.
Good afternoon. My name is Dominic Alicia, and I'd like to compliment you on an excellent lecture. I want to just respond to two slides which caught my attention the most. The first slide was the slide you showed of our old business district called Escolta, and the comments you made about, before we build anything new, we must first restore and honor those buildings. And I think it's interesting that it's coming from someone from outside the country to tell us to preserve these important patrimonial gifts. The second slide I'm reacting to is the last slide you showed of the hut that was built by one of the current Taliesin students, of a kind of an ironic facsimile of an earlier tent. The rendering of a stone wall in a translucent plexiglass, and the rendering of the canvas roof as a image on a solid roof. And I find those two images of Escolta and the notions of authenticity and materiality that those bring to mind in relation to the kind of, really what strikes me the most about the last images was its notion of its sense of irony, the ironic sense of its phenomenology. That what is solid becomes light and what is light becomes heavy. And I wonder, and my reaction to it is this, the question, is this the direction that we are heading towards, that, things that we're, in a sense, canonical from the past, things that we respected in terms of material and form in the past, are we turning away from that, or is this a reminder that we should go back to that kind of rumination?
It's a really good question, and I think that one of the things we have to realize is and again, I should just again say that, I've only been here for 2 days, so my knowledge is about that thing. But just from what I can see, here, like everywhere, not just in the Philippines, but in the United States, Europe, everywhere around the world, what you're looking at are fictions. What you're looking at are plaster or later steel versions of neoclassical elements or of bits and pieces of other construction technology that is reassembled to represent the power or the glamour of a department store or of an office building. And they were fictions in the time. And if we realize that they were themselves fictions and that they were selling their own version of capitalism, and we now, if we're going to come back to them, have to figure out how to develop a critical attitude, both in terms of material and in terms of aesthetics. That to me is going to be the most interesting way to approach it. You know, I come to this a lot from a movement that started in 1993 called Block Designs, Blue Design, which was industrial design movement where people started by rethinking and reusing things, but filled with wit and irony. And I would say that's one of the things that we need to also do. And I agree with Mr. Lowe completely that these issues are completely serious and of fundamental importance, and that's what I've been trying to say. But we also have to figure out how to approach them with wit, with irony, with having fun, with celebration, with all the kind of things that will not let us say, oh, this is just a serious issue and therefore we're only going to do it because it hurts. But rather say, no, this is who we are as human beings. This is how inventive we have been and can be. This is the joy, the fun, the weirdness of what these buildings were and could be. So it's also enjoying everything that is strange, everything that is contradictory about it. Hi.
So fun. I just wanted to say how, perhaps by this presentation that you had, you brought somehow a freshness to how we might possibly approach our city. There are a lot of pain points by which we can approach the problems and the questions that arise from being in the city of Manila. Currently in our school, and the curator is right here also, he put up an exhibit on two film directors who are national artists who have created films in the 70s and 80s. And if we watch the movies right now, and we see Manila, it's like nothing has changed. Yeah. So it's because of the apathy that Edson instead was talking about. And I think by what you have suggested by your presentation, it will cause us to think and rethink how we can find appreciation in, of course, these are negative things. In fact, the exhibit is called Broca, Biennale, and the City, because it's about these two directors and the city, and how we wanted to really rethink our way of looking at the city of Manila and perhaps every other city in the country. For this, I wanted to go back to your slide, where you found that in Rome, when you wanted to put up that mosque. I'm sorry that my friend, who is not here, but he's going to write about, sorry Jerry, I have to blow this. He talked about phantom landmarks. Because it's true. I mean, there are things that are supposed to be here, but they're not here anymore. And so my friend, he will talk about this particular thing, and I will tell him about your presentation, because it is possible that it's not about lights or something that's on top. It's like the reality that it's not there, but it's there. And so I think at this point it's not physical architecture, but the metaphysical is being looked into. And I thank you.
Thank you. Not sure if that was a question, but I would say, just to sort of follow up also a little bit, the Philippines, together with Thailand, I think has more shopping malls per population than any other country. I don't know why, but we seem to be the two countries. That's going to end pretty soon. In the United States and Europe, shopping malls already died. And that's going to happen here too. What are you going to do with those shopping malls? Because yours were built even later than many of the American ones, and they're probably built even worse.
and they're bigger. What are you going to do with them? It's a tremendous amount of resources in those shopping malls. If I was teaching a studio here, that's what I would teach, is how to, when the Mall of Asia fails, which it will sooner than one would guess, then how do you reweave the Mall of Asia? Because those are going to become those are going to become the issues today.
And more question from the audience.
No more questions. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Kindly join me center stage, and we will call on the principal architect of WTA Architecture in Santiago, Mr. William P.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, once again, Mr. Aaron Betsky.